The first thing people noticed about the ranch wasn't the size of it, or the way the grass rolled outward like an ocean that never met a shore. It was the fence. It didn't look pretty, and it didn't try to. It was old, sun-faded, and honest, thick posts, tight wire, and a gate that had been swung open and shut so many times it moved like it had its own muscle memory. That fence had been there longer than most of the nearby homes, had been dreams in a developer's mind. It marked a line that had been surveyed, recorded, and respected back when neighborhood meant a few miles of space between families, not a managed community with matching mailboxes and rules printed in glossy packets. The ranch sat where the paved roads stopped, pretending they owned the land. It had a long gravel drive, a weathered barn, and a house that had never been designed to impress anyone who didn't understand what work looked like. For years, life there moved by season and responsibility. Repairs happened before they became emergencies. Animals were checked before breakfast. Water lines were watched like you'd watch your own pulse. The ranch didn't care about trends, and it definitely didn't care about the politics of people who believed authority came from a title on a committee. The neighborhood came later, like a wave that arrived quietly, then tried to rewrite the shoreline. At first, it was just a few for sale, signs on land that used to be scrub and undeveloped lots. Then the machines showed up. The bulldozers carved out streets and flattened trees, and the quiet sound of wind through open space got replaced by nail guns, concrete trucks, and the constant hum of progress. The ranch owner watched it happen the way a person watches a storm build on the horizon. Not with panic, but with awareness. The land had been through worse. It had survived droughts and hard winters, economic swings and family losses, and it had never asked permission to remain. When the first houses were finished, they looked like they'd been stamped from the same mold, clean, bright, and identical in a way that suggested the people who lived there wanted comfort more than character. Along with those houses came the HOA, the invisible crown that certain personalities couldn't wait to wear. At the beginning, there was an unspoken arrangement. The ranch stayed a ranch. The neighborhood stayed a neighborhood. Their worlds brushed up against each other at the property line and then separated again. The ranch owner didn't attend meetings, didn't use the pool, didn't care about the landscaping rules or the neighborhood newsletter. He paid taxes to the county and kept the ranch running. He'd grown up in a world where your word mattered, where boundaries were agreed upon in ink and stone, not social pressure. And the HOA, for a while, kept its energy pointed inward, busy policing trash cans and mailbox colors. Everyone seemed content to pretend the ranch was simply part of the scenery, something rustic to look at from the back patio, like a piece of decor that came with the view. That illusion lasted until the day the first boundary lie was told with confidence. It began with small things the way these dramas always do, little nudges that test whether someone will push back. A new community walking trail appeared on a neighborhood map. It was advertised as a benefit, something to increase property value and bring people together. The trail wasn't built yet, but the chatter about it traveled fast. People liked the idea of access. They liked the idea of nature without the inconvenience of respect. And when the HOA board posted their cheerful update online, the ranch owner noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The trail line, drawn in bright color, didn't stop at the neighborhood fence. It curved casually across land that had never belonged to them. It ran along the ranch's edge like a hand reaching into someone else's pocket while smiling. The ranch owner didn't react publicly. He didn't write angry posts or start online arguments. He did what ranch people do when something feels off. He checked. He walked the fence line the next morning in the thin light before the day heated up, boots crunching on gravel, eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong. The posts were still solid, the wire was still tight, the markers, those old metal stakes and carved stones from prior surveys, were still where they'd always been. The land didn't move, the fence didn't move. But the neighborhood's imagination clearly had. A week later, the first trespassers arrived like they'd been invited. They didn't climb the fence, at least not at first. They hovered at the gate, peering in, taking pictures, pointing toward the creek that cut through the ranch like a ribbon of darker green. They looked harmless, like people on a casual walk. But harmlessness has nothing to do with rights. The ranch owner watched them from a distance, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to understand the shape of the problem. It wasn't just curiosity. It was entitlement dressed up as recreation. The kind that spreads once it learns you'll tolerate it. Then the signs appeared. At first, just one. Bright, new, printed in a style that matched the HOA branding. It was planted near the ranch's fence, as if it had a claim to stand there. It welcomed residents to enjoy the community trail, and pointed an arrow that directed them straight along the ranch boundary. The ranch owner found it after noticing fresh footprints near the gate, and a new path forming where there hadn't been one. He pulled the sign out of the ground, stared at it for a long moment, and felt something colder than anger settle in his chest. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. Someone had decided the ranch was available for use. Someone had decided the fence was negotiable. He brought the sign back to his barn and set it down like evidence. Then he went to the county website and printed the parcel maps, not because he needed reassurance, but because he understood how these situations escalated. People like this didn't respond to common sense. They responded to embarrassment, enforcement, or legal consequences. He pulled out the old survey documents his family had kept in a metal box, papers that smelled faintly of dust and time, stamped and signed, with measurements written by professionals who didn't care about anyone's feelings. The lines were clear. The ranch line was the ranch line. The HOA map was wrong. The ranch owner expected the HOA to correct it once confronted. He expected, maybe, some quiet backpedaling, a polite apology. A revised trail route. That's what a reasonable organization would do when shown official documentation. But the HOA wasn't built for reason. It was built for control, and control becomes a hunger in the hands of people who don't have enough of it elsewhere. Instead of backing down, the HOA doubled down with that bright, confident aggression that always precedes a public disaster. Within days, another sign appeared, then another. They popped up like weeds, each one placed with more boldness, each one implying that the ranch boundary was up for debate. And then the woman arrived. Every neighborhood has one, and everyone knows what she looks like even before she speaks. She didn't come alone. She came with posture, with a clipboard, with the kind of expression that assumed she'd already won. She parked her SUV near the ranch gate, like she owned the gravel. She walked up to the fence and studied it, as if it were an obstacle put there specifically to inconvenience her. She didn't look at the land the way someone admires a landscape. She looked at it the way someone looks at a resource they want to claim. The ranch owner saw her from the porch and felt that old instinct flare, the one that warns you when trouble isn't accidental. She lingered near the gate, taking pictures, tapping her phone, pointing toward the old creek line like she was outlining a plan. She didn't try to open the gate, not yet, but the message was loud anyway. It was a message of ownership, of intrusion, of escalation. The ranch owner walked down his drive, steady and calm, and stopped on his side of the fence. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to act tough. The fence itself was already saying what needed to be said. Private property, boundary, stop here. The woman didn't respond to the fence. She responded to the idea that someone had the power to tell her no. Her expression sharpened, not into fear, but into offense, the kind that comes from believing rules exist for other people. She gestured at the trail sign and then at the ranch land beyond it, as if pointing could rewrite law. Her phone was still in her hand, angled like a weapon. She didn't need a badge to act like she had authority. She just needed an audience, and the neighborhood, eager for drama and validation, was always ready to be won. The ranch owner went back to the house with the same calm he'd walked down with, but his mind was already moving faster than his steps. He knew what was coming. People like her didn't stop at posting signs. They didn't stop at taking pictures. They didn't stop at gossip. When they couldn't win through social pressure, they reached for institutions, police, city officials, code enforcement, anything that could be used like a hammer. And she looked like someone who had spent her life learning which numbers to dial to make other people jump. That evening, a new post appeared in the neighborhood group. It wasn't subtle. It was a warning wrapped in righteous language, framed as concern and safety and keeping our community protected. It claimed the ranch owner was obstructing community access. It implied he was trespassing on land that supposedly belonged to the HOA. It called his fence an illegal barrier. It suggested he was hostile, unreasonable, dangerous. The comments piled up quickly, fueled by people who loved outrage more than facts. Some demanded action. Some demanded punishment. Some demanded that the HOA do something. And the woman with the clipboard responded like she'd been waiting for her moment. She promised she would handle it. The ranch owner read it once, then closed the screen. He didn't need to argue online. He knew what mattered wasn't the noise. It was the paperwork. It was the survey. It was the county record that didn't care about neighborhood opinions. Still, the post left a bitter taste because it wasn't just misinformation. It was a deliberate attempt to flip reality, to turn the rightful owner into the intruder, to make the land itself feel negotiable through repetition. The next morning, the ranch owner found fresh tire tracks near the fence line, deep enough to suggest someone had driven close, maybe to test the ground, maybe to plan where the trail would cut through. The grass was pressed down in a strip where no strip belonged, and near the gate, someone had hung a temporary ribbon, bright and mocking, like a marker for future construction. It wasn't just trespassing now. It was preparation. He stood there in the early light, looking out across his own land, and the quiet felt different than it had the day before. Not peaceful, not earned. It felt tense, like the moment before a gate slams shut in a windstorm. He could sense a confrontation forming, not because he wanted it, but because someone else did. Someone who believed the police were a tool, not a service. Someone who believed authority could be summoned like a personal assistant. By midday, as the sun climbed and the air warmed, the ranch owner heard a sound that didn't belong on his drive. Another vehicle approaching with purpose. He didn't know yet if it was an HOA representative, a contractor, or something more official. But he knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from experience, that this wasn't going to stay a simple boundary disagreement. This was the beginning of an attempt to take what wasn't offered. And somewhere beyond that fence, the woman with the clipboard was likely already dialing the number she thought would make the ranch kneel. The ranch owner didn't move the fence. He didn't shift an inch of wire. He simply waited, grounded on land his family had held for generations, while the neighborhood's manufactured authority gathered momentum. The next chapter of the story was already pulling into view, riding on tires and entitlement, heading straight for a line that had never moved. The sound of the approaching vehicle resolved itself into something unmistakable as it rolled down the gravel drive. It wasn't the hurried pace of a neighbor late for work, or the casual slowdown of someone lost. It moved with intent, tires crunching deliberately, engine idling with patience rather than uncertainty. The ranch owner watched from the porch as the car came into view, sunlight flashing across the windshield, before settling into the familiar outline of a patrol vehicle. It parked not at the gate, but just inside the shoulder of the county road, close enough to feel present, far enough to suggest caution. The ranch owner didn't feel fear at the sight. What he felt was irritation sharpened by recognition. The woman hadn't waited. She'd gone straight to escalation, exactly as expected. Law enforcement stepping onto private land carried a particular weight, not because it was inherently threatening, but because it signaled a shift from neighborly dispute to institutional involvement. The ranch owner knew better than to assume the officers had any context beyond what they'd been told. Calls like this rarely came with nuance. They came packaged in urgency, framed by the caller's version of reality. Someone had likely reported an aggressive landowner, an illegal fence, maybe even a trespasser refusing to leave community property. The ranch owner took a breath, steadying himself, and walked down the porch steps at an unhurried pace. Calm mattered, facts mattered, everything else was noise. The officers stepped out of the vehicle and scanned the property the way professionals do, taking in details without commentary. They saw the fence, the gate, the expanse of land beyond. They saw the house set back from the road, the barn, the livestock grazing at a distance. Nothing about the scene screamed criminality. Nothing about it suggested urgency. That disconnect between the call they'd received and the reality in front of them lingered in the air like static. The ranch owner stopped several feet from the fence line, well within his own property, and waited. He didn't rush to explain. He didn't posture. He understood that credibility often belonged to the person who didn't act defensive before being accused. The officers approached the fence, eyes shifting from the ranch owner to the posted HOA sign that still clung to the wire like a misplaced badge. One of them bent slightly to read it, expression tightening in mild confusion. Signs like that didn't usually show up on private ranch fences without paperwork to back them up. The ranch owner could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. Something didn't line up. They asked for identification, and he provided it without hesitation. They asked if he lived there. He confirmed it simply. They asked if he knew why they were there. He answered truthfully that he could guess. As they spoke, another vehicle pulled up behind the patrol car, its polished exterior and decorative license plate frame announcing itself before the door even opened. The woman stepped out with the confidence of someone who believed the situation had already been decided. She didn't glance at the ranch owner first. She went straight to the officers, posture upright, shoulders squared, phone already in hand. She looked relieved, validated, empowered. This was her stage. The ranch owner watched the shift in energy the moment she arrived. Her presence added volume to the situation, even without words. She positioned herself near the officers, not beside them, but slightly ahead, as if proximity could translate into authority. The officers listened, and the ranch owner didn't interrupt. He knew better than to compete with someone eager to perform. She gestured broadly toward the ranch, toward the fence, toward the land beyond, framing the space as something that had been taken rather than something that had always existed. Her body language carried accusation in every movement. She pointed to the sign as if it were proof, not decoration. She angled her phone toward the ranch owner at times, recording, documenting, preserving what she believed would be her victory. The ranch owner stayed still, arms relaxed, expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that letting someone overplay their hand was often the fastest route to clarity. When the woman finished, the officers turned back to the ranch owner. They asked him to explain the situation from his perspective. He didn't launch into emotion or insult. He didn't mention entitlement or HOA politics. He talked about land records, about surveys, about a fence that had stood in the same place for decades. He explained that the HOA trail map was wrong and that the signs had been placed without permission. He mentioned that he'd already pulled county parcel records to confirm what he already knew. He spoke in a measured tone, the kind that didn't beg to be believed, but assumed it would be. The officers exchanged a look, subtle but meaningful. This wasn't their first property dispute. They'd seen plenty of cases where emotions ran high and facts ran thin. What they hadn't expected was the confidence with which the ranch owner referenced documentation. He didn't hesitate when asked if he could produce proof. He gestured toward the house and offered to retrieve the survey papers. The woman reacted instantly, shifting her weight, folding her arms, visibly displeased by the turn. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was supposed to end with the ranch owner being warned, maybe cited, maybe embarrassed into compliance. Instead, it was drifting toward verification. The ranch owner returned moments later with a folder worn soft at the edges, its contents older than the HOA itself. He handed it over without ceremony. The officers examined the papers carefully, tracing lines, reading dates, noting stamps. The longer they looked, the quieter the scene became. The woman tried to fill the silence with presence, hovering, pointing, offering commentary that wasn't requested. The officers didn't engage. They were focused now, and focus had a way of shutting out performance. What unfolded over the next several minutes was the slow unraveling of a confident lie. The survey lines were clear. The boundary markers referenced in the documents matched physical points on the land. The fence followed those lines precisely. There was no ambiguity, no overlap, no shared easement. The trail, as drawn by the HOA, cut cleanly through private property without legal basis. The sign hanging on the fence wasn't just misplaced, it was unauthorized. The officer's expressions shifted from neutral to mildly concerned, not for the ranch owner, but for the implications of what they were seeing. They asked the woman where the HOA had obtained its boundary information. She gestured vaguely, citing community maps, developer plans, assumptions layered on top of convenience. She didn't have documents to match the ranch owners. She had confidence, repetition, and a belief that authority could be manifested through insistence. The officers explained, calmly and clearly, that insistence didn't override recorded land ownership. They explained that placing signage on private property without consent was itself a violation. They explained that calling in a trespass complaint against the landowner on his own property was not just incorrect, but potentially problematic. The shift in power was almost visible, like a shadow passing over the woman's face. Her posture stiffened, her phone dipped slightly. This was no longer the validation she'd expected. This was a warning wrapped in professionalism. The officers didn't scold her, but they didn't side with her either. They informed her that any further attempts to assert access over the ranch land would need to go through proper legal channels, not enforcement calls. They suggested pointedly that the HOA correct its maps and remove its signage immediately. The ranch owner listened without gloating. He didn't smile. He didn't comment on the irony. He understood something the woman didn't. This wasn't over. People like her didn't retreat quietly when exposed. They recalibrated. The officers wrapped up the interaction with a reminder that misuse of emergency services was taken seriously. They returned the survey papers with a nod of respect that didn't need to be verbalized. As the patrol car pulled away, the woman lingered, staring at the fence as if daring it to apologize. The ranch owner met her gaze briefly, then turned back toward his house. He didn't need the last word. The land had already spoken, but as the dust settled and the quiet returned, the ranch owner felt the tension remain, coiled and unresolved. The call had changed the tone, not because it ended the dispute, but because it escalated the stakes. The woman had learned she couldn't win with assumptions alone, and people who lose once often come back louder, more desperate, and less careful. The ranch owner closed the door behind him, aware that the next move wouldn't be a mistake. It would be retaliation. The quiet that followed the patrol car's departure was deceptive. On the surface, everything returned to its familiar rhythm, the wind brushing through the tall grass, the distant sound of livestock moving lazily across the pasture, the creak of the barn door settling back into place. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. The ranch owner felt it in the way the silence pressed closer than before, in the way the air seemed to wait instead of flow. The woman hadn't driven off in anger or embarrassment. She'd driven off calculating. That difference mattered more than any raised voice ever could. By evening, the neighborhood group was on fire. Screens lit up with outrage framed as concern, speculation dressed as certainty, and half-truths repeated until they felt solid. The story had already been rewritten. The police visit was described not as a clarification, but as intimidation. The ranch owner was no longer a quiet neighbor minding his land. He was portrayed as an obstacle, a problem, someone hostile to community progress. The word trespassing appeared again and again, flipped like a coin that always landed in her favor. It didn't matter that the officers had disagreed. What mattered was controlling the narrative before facts could slow it down. The woman posted first, and she posted with authority. She spoke as if she were relaying official information, summarizing the encounter in a way that conveniently excluded everything that contradicted her position. She implied the officers had been uncertain. She suggested the boundary was under review. She hinted at legal ambiguity where none existed. She framed the ranch owner's refusal to allow access as selfish, even dangerous, implying that blocking the trail endangered families by limiting safe walking routes. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, not because it was clever, but because it relied on an audience willing to believe what made them feel justified. The ranch owner didn't respond online. He'd already learned that correcting misinformation in spaces designed for outrage only fed it. Instead, he spent the evening reviewing the county records more thoroughly, pulling not just the survey but the historical plat maps, the transfer deeds, and the easement filings that traced the land's ownership back decades. He printed copies, not because he expected to need them immediately, but because preparation was a form of self-defense. When someone decided to challenge reality, the only winning move was to outlast them with proof. The next morning, the first physical change appeared. Survey flags, bright, artificial, and entirely out of place, had been planted along the ranch's side of the fence, just a few feet in, like a suggestion disguised as a decision. They fluttered in the breeze, marking a line that existed only in someone's imagination. The ranch owner stopped his truck and stared at them for a long moment, anger simmering but controlled. This wasn't confusion. This was provocation. Someone had crossed the fence intentionally, planted markers on private land, and left them there as a statement. He removed the flags one by one, pulling them from the soil and stacking them neatly in the bed of his truck. He didn't tear them out violently. He didn't leave them broken. He treated them the way you treat trash that doesn't belong to you, firmly, efficiently, without ceremony. But as he worked, he noticed footprints again, deeper this time, and tire tracks that cut closer to the creek than before. Someone had walked the land like they owned it, measuring with steps instead of instruments, deciding with confidence that the ranch was simply in the way. By midday, an email arrived. It wasn't sent to him directly. It was sent to the county planning office, the sheriff's department, and several local officials, with his name copied in at the end like an afterthought. It was written in polished language, full of buzzwords and civic concern. It alleged that the ranch owner had removed official survey markers, obstructed a planned community project, and acted aggressively toward HOA representatives. It requested immediate intervention. It demanded enforcement. It framed the situation not as a dispute, but as noncompliance. The ranch owner read it carefully, line by line. He recognized the strategy immediately. When one authority failed to deliver the desired outcome, another was summoned. When facts didn't cooperate, volume was increased. The woman wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. She was trying to overwhelm the system with persistence. The hope was that eventually, someone would act just to make the noise stop. That afternoon, a county truck pulled up near the ranch road. This one wasn't law enforcement, but it carried its own weight. The planning department didn't respond quickly unless pressured, and pressure had clearly been applied. The official stepped out with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd already had a long day. The ranch owner met him at the fence, once again on his own side, once again calm. The inspection was brief but telling. The county official walked the fence line, compared it to the parcel map on his tablet, and frowned. The markers matched, the fence matched. The flags that had been planted didn't correspond to any recorded survey. The HOA trail plan, when pulled up, showed a clear encroachment. There was no gray area. The official noted it all, taking photos, documenting the condition of the land. He asked about the removed flags, and the ranch owner explained where they'd been placed and why they'd been removed. The explanation was accepted without drama. What unsettled the county official wasn't the ranch owner's actions. It was the pattern emerging behind them, multiple complaints, inconsistent claims, a push to establish access without legal groundwork. Before leaving, the official mentioned almost casually that if unauthorized markers continued to appear, it could be considered harassment. The ranch owner nodded, understanding the significance of that word. Harassment changed the framing. It shifted scrutiny away from the person defending their land and toward the person refusing to respect boundaries. The woman didn't stop. She escalated sideways. Flyers appeared on mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, printed professionally, urging residents to attend an emergency HOA meeting regarding the land access crisis. The language was urgent, dramatic, and carefully slanted. It painted the ranch as an obstacle to community growth, the owner as unreasonable, and the situation as something that required unity against a common problem. The problem, of course, being a man who refused to give away what was his. The ranch owner heard about the meeting secondhand. A neighbor who lived closest to the boundary stopped by, uncomfortable but honest. She explained that people were being encouraged to document trespassing incidents by the ranch owner, to report him if he crossed into community land. The absurdity of the claim would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Accusations didn't need to be true to be damaging. They just needed to be repeated. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the pasture, the ranch owner walked the fence again. He checked every post, every wire, every gate. He photographed the boundary markers, logging their condition and location. He wasn't paranoid. He was methodical. Experience had taught him that when people failed to bend reality with words, they sometimes tried to move physical evidence. Near the creek, he found something that confirmed his instincts. A freshly disturbed patch of soil near one of the oldest markers, as if someone had tried to dig it up and failed. The marker itself was still there, solid and unmoved, but the attempt was obvious. This wasn't just about a trail anymore. This was about erasing proof. The ranch owner straightened and looked out over the land, feeling a mix of anger and resolve. He understood now that the woman's goal wasn't shared space. It was dominance. She wanted to win, not negotiate. She wanted the ranch to submit to the HOA authority, to acknowledge that the neighborhood's rules could reach beyond its borders. As night settled in, another message arrived, this one from the HOA legal counsel. It was brief, formal, and ominous. It suggested mediation. It hinted at litigation. It warned of consequences if community development continued to be obstructed. The ranch owner read it twice, then set it aside. He wasn't intimidated by the language. He was interested in what it revealed. They were preparing to formalize the lie. The maps had become weapons, not because they were accurate, but because they were being used to challenge something older and stronger than a homeowners association. The ranch owner knew the next chapter wouldn't play out quietly. It would involve lawyers, letters, and perhaps another call to the police. But the more the HOA pushed, the clearer the truth became. And truth, unlike entitlement, didn't get tired of standing still. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, chosen deliberately for maximum attendance and minimum patience. By the time the sun dropped behind the rows of identical rooftops, the community clubhouse parking lot was already full. Cars lined the street, engines still ticking with heat as residents streamed inside, carrying with them frustration that had been carefully cultivated over days of posts, flyers, and selective storytelling. The ranch owner wasn't there, and that absence was used as evidence. It was framed as refusal, defiance, even guilt. In reality, it was restraint. He understood that spaces like that weren't built for resolution. They were built for reinforcement. Inside the meeting, the woman stood at the center of attention, not officially elevated by a podium, but by posture and momentum. She had charts, printed maps, and enlarged images taped to presentation boards. None of them matched county records, but they didn't need to. They matched the story she wanted to tell. She spoke in terms of community rights and shared access, repeating phrases until they sounded like law. She pointed to the ranch boundary on her version of the map, describing it as historically unclear, despite decades of documentation to the contrary. Every assertion was delivered with confidence, and confidence was contagious. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Authority in that space wasn't determined by accuracy. It was determined by volume. The HOA board members followed her lead, some enthusiastically, others reluctantly. A few understood the risk of pushing too far, but none wanted to be the one to slow the momentum. Slowing it would have meant questioning the narrative, and questioning the narrative would have meant standing apart. The meeting concluded with a vote, not on ownership, which they had no power to decide, but on next steps. Legal consultation was approved. Additional surveys were authorized, though none were county sanctioned. And most notably, a motion passed to document all instances of obstruction or interference by the ranch owner. It was an open invitation for surveillance disguised as civic duty. While the neighborhood gathered its energy, the ranch owner was doing something far less dramatic and far more effective. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a retired surveyor he'd known for years, a man who'd worked the county lines back when the area was still mostly open land. The table was covered in map, sold, new, and everything in between. The surveyor traced lines with a steady finger, explaining how the boundary had been established, how markers were placed, how errors were corrected when development encroached too aggressively. He pointed out the exact point where the HOA trail plan diverged from reality. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't close. It was wrong by a margin that couldn't be explained by rounding errors or outdated data. The ranch owner listened, asked questions, and took notes. This wasn't about proving ownership to himself. It was about preparing for the moment when proof would need to be presented not just as documentation, but as undeniable narrative. People like the woman didn't respond to quiet explanations. They responded when their story collapsed under its own weight. 2 days later, the next escalation arrived in the form of a certified letter. It claimed to be a formal notice from the HOA, alleging that the ranch owner was unlawfully restricting access to what they referred to as a historically shared corridor. The phrase was vague by design. It cited community welfare, environmental stewardship, and future development plans. It threatened fines, though none could legally be imposed. It hinted at enforcement action, though none was authorized. The letter wasn't legally binding, but it was intimidating to anyone unfamiliar with the limits of HOA power. The ranch owner read it once and placed it in a growing folder labeled simply encroachment attempts. He didn't respond immediately. Silence at this stage was strategic. Every baseless threat added weight to the record he was building. The following weekend, the first real confrontation happened without uniforms or official vehicles. A group of residents, emboldened by the meeting and armed with printed maps, walked the boundary together. They didn't cross the fence at first. They stood near it, pointing, measuring with steps, debating among themselves where the real line should be. The ranch owner observed from a distance, not interfering, documenting with photographs and timestamps. He watched as the group grew more confident, more animated. And then, inevitably, one of them ducked under the wire to get a better look. That single step changed everything. What had been passive pressure became active trespass. The ranch owner didn't rush down. He didn't shout. He called the sheriff's department and reported unauthorized entry onto his property, providing clear details and referencing prior incidents. The call was calm, factual, and impossible to dismiss as frivolous. When the patrol car arrived, the group scattered back to the neighborhood side of the fence, suddenly unsure of their authority. The officers took statements, observed the boundary, and documented the incident. This time the dynamic was different. This time there was a pattern: previous calls, previous complaints, previous attempts to assert access without basis. The ranch owner didn't need to say much. The record spoke for him. Word of the incident spread quickly, but not in the way the woman intended. Some residents began to question the story they'd been told. They'd been promised clarity and legality, not police involvement. Doubt crept in quietly, especially among those who'd assumed the HOA had done its homework. The woman responded by increasing her visibility. She posted updates, reassurances, and calls for unity. She framed the police response as overreach, the ranch owner as antagonistic. But the cracks were forming. Behind the scenes, the HOA legal counsel requested copies of the county survey. They asked for documentation. They asked questions that hadn't been asked before. The tone shifted from aggressive to cautious. Legal reality was beginning to intrude on the manufactured certainty of the meeting room. The ranch owner received a call from the county planning office later that week. They informed him that due to the volume of complaints and conflicting claims, a formal boundary verification would be conducted by the county itself. It wasn't framed as a favor. It was framed as a necessity. The process would be slow, thorough, and final. Once completed, it would leave little room for interpretation. That night, the ranch owner walked out onto his land under a sky heavy with stars, the kind of sky you only see when development hasn't fully erased the dark. He stood near the creek, listening to the water move steadily over stone, unchanged by meetings or letters or threats. The land didn't argue. It didn't raise its voice. It simply existed, patient and unmoved. The woman, meanwhile, was losing control of the tempo. Authority by volume only worked as long as no one checked the source. With a county survey looming and law enforcement documentation piling up, her narrative was at risk. She had forced the issue into a space where confidence wasn't enough. As the night settled in, the ranch owner understood that the next chapter wouldn't be about persuasion or pressure. It would be about exposure. And once exposed, lies had a way of collapsing faster than anyone expected. The county survey team arrived early, not out of urgency, but out of habit. Their trucks rolled in just after sunrise, tires humming softly on the road before crunching into the gravel shoulder near the ranch gate. There was no spectacle to their presence, no flashing lights or raised voices. They moved with the quiet confidence of people whose authority came from accuracy, not assertion. The ranch owner watched from a distance as they unloaded equipment, tripods, measuring rods, instruments precise enough to make arguments irrelevant. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was measurement. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood. Curtains shifted. Garage doors paused mid-lift. People slowed their morning routines just long enough to watch the scene unfold. Some expected the survey to confirm what they'd been told. Others, quietly, hoped it wouldn't. The woman arrived shortly after, her SUV pulling up with more speed than necessary. She parked close, stepping out with her familiar clipboard and a carefully arranged expression of confidence. She greeted the surveyors with practiced friendliness, positioning herself as a stakeholder rather than an observer. The surveyors acknowledged her presence politely and then continued working. They didn't engage in explanations. They didn't validate concerns. They followed the process. Markers were located, instruments aligned, lines drawn based on data that predated the HOA, the neighborhood, and most of the people watching. The ranch owner stayed back, letting the professionals do their work without interference. He understood that credibility came from restraint as much as from proof. As the morning wore on, the surveyor's findings became increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention. The fence line matched the county records with near-perfect precision. The old boundary markers, some of them decades old, were exactly where the document said they should be. The creek fell entirely within the ranch property, not on a shared line, not within an easement. The HOA trail map, when overlaid digitally against the county data, was revealed as dramatically inaccurate. The proposed path cut through private land by a margin that couldn't be explained away. The woman hovered closer, her earlier confidence thinning as the data accumulated. She asked questions, pointed to her maps, suggested alternative interpretations. The surveyors responded with calm professionalism, explaining methodology, referencing records, and returning always to the same conclusion. There was no ambiguity to exploit, no gray area to stretch. The truth was stubbornly clear. By midday, temporary county markers were placed along the confirmed boundary, bright but official, each one a quiet declaration. Contrast between these and the unauthorized flags that had appeared earlier couldn't have been more stark. These weren't suggestions, they were conclusions. The survey team documented everything, took photographs, and logged their findings for formal submission. The process was methodical, immune to emotion. The neighborhood mood shifted palpably. Conversations quieted. Some residents drifted away, suddenly less invested now that certainty was replacing outrage. Others lingered, watching the woman with curiosity rather than agreement. She was no longer the voice of clarity. She was a figure caught between insistence and evidence. That afternoon, the county posted a preliminary notice online, stating that the boundary verification confirmed the ranch owner's property lines as recorded. It was dry, factual, and devastating to the HOA narrative. The post didn't name the dispute or assign blame. It didn't need to. The implications were obvious. The woman responded within minutes, attempting damage control. She framed the survey as one interpretation and promised further review. But the urgency in her tone betrayed her. The certainty that had carried her through meetings and posts was gone, replaced by defensiveness. Some residents began asking questions she couldn't answer. Others went quiet, unwilling to publicly admit they'd been misled. The ranch owner spent the evening fielding calls, not from the HOA, but from neighbors. Some were apologetic. Some were curious. Some wanted reassurance that the fence would stay where it was. He answered politely but briefly. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about boundaries, literal and otherwise. Late that night, another certified letter arrived, this one from the HOA legal counsel, noticeably toned down. It acknowledged the county's preliminary findings while reserving the right to review. It suggested temporary suspension of trail development pending final confirmation. It no longer threatened fines. It no longer demanded access. It was the first sign of retreat. But retreat didn't mean surrender. The ranch owner understood that the woman hadn't come this far to walk away quietly. Exposure didn't always end conflicts. Sometimes it made them personal. He reviewed his documentation again, noting every interaction, every attempt to encroach, every false claim. Patterns mattered. As he stepped outside before bed, the county markers caught the moonlight along the fence line, standing like sentinels. They didn't raise their voices, they didn't argue, they simply marked what had always been true. The survey had spoken louder than any meeting or post ever could, and now that the truth was visible, the question wasn't whether the HOA was wrong. It was how far the woman would go to avoid admitting it. The county's preliminary findings didn't just clarify a boundary. They shifted the direction of attention. For the first time since the dispute began, scrutiny turned away from the ranch owner and toward the behavior that had triggered the verification in the first place. What had been framed as a land access issue was now quietly becoming something else. A pattern of overreach, misrepresentation, and escalation that could no longer hide behind community concern. The woman felt the shift immediately. Confidence that had once fueled her actions now pushed her into overdrive, as if volume alone could reverse gravity. Her posts grew more frequent and more defensive. She shared screenshots of emails stripped of context, highlighted phrases that seemed supportive, and dismissed anything contradictory as temporary or flawed. She spoke about appeals, about second opinions, about private surveys that would supposedly tell a different story. But even as she talked, the audience was thinning. Residents who had once echoed her certainty now watched with distance. Some deleted their earlier comments. Others stopped engaging altogether. Silence, in a group built on consensus, was a kind of judgment. Behind the scenes, the HOA board was fracturing. Emails circulated internally, their tone markedly different from the public face. Board members questioned how the trail plan had been approved without proper verification. They asked who had authorized the placement of signs and markers on private property. They reviewed meeting minutes and found that key decisions had been made informally, driven by enthusiasm rather than process. The woman, once seen as decisive, was now being viewed as impulsive. Liability has a way of changing loyalties. The ranch owner felt the change not through apology, but through restraint. The harassment slowed. No new flags appeared, no new signs were placed. The group walk stopped. It wasn't peace, but it was pause, and pauses were when consequences caught up. The first formal notice arrived from the county's legal department, not addressed to the ranch owner, but to the HOA. It outlined concerns regarding unauthorized activity on private land, including signage placement and attempted alteration of survey markers. It requested documentation, timelines, and authorization records. It used careful language, but the message was unmistakable. Explain yourselves. The ranch owner received a copy for his records. He added it to the folder, now thick with paper and proof. The woman responded publicly before the HOA responded officially. She framed the notice as routine, as something all development projects encountered. She reassured residents that nothing was wrong. But the reassurance rang hollow, especially as more people began to notice what wasn't being said. There were no confident deadlines anymore, no promised outcomes, just repetition and deflection. Then the sheriff's department followed up, not with another visit, but with a call requesting clarification about previous reports. They were reviewing calls made regarding trespass allegations, including the initial complaint against the ranch owner. Patterns were being analyzed: frequency, accuracy, outcome. The ranch owner answered calmly, providing dates, references, and outcomes. He didn't accuse, he simply confirmed. What the woman hadn't anticipated was how institutions treated repeated false claims. One mistake might be forgiven, A pattern raised flags. Law enforcement didn't appreciate being used as leverage in private disputes. Neither did county offices. The very tools she'd tried to weaponize were now quietly evaluating her conduct. The HOA legal counsel requested a private meeting with the ranch owner. The tone of the request was markedly different from earlier letters. It was no longer confrontational. It was cautious, almost conciliatory. They acknowledged the county's findings and expressed concern about procedural missteps. They asked whether the ranch owner would be open to discussing resolution. The ranch owner agreed to meet, not out of obligation, but out of strategy. Resolution didn't mean concession, it meant clarity. The meeting took place in a neutral office, far from the neighborhood and the land itself. The council arrived with folders and a careful demeanor. They explained that the HOA board was reconsidering its position, that the trail plan would likely be abandoned or rerouted entirely within community land. They emphasized that the HOA wanted to avoid further conflict. The ranch owner listened without interruption. When it was his turn, he laid out his conditions simply. The signs would be removed. The unauthorized materials would be destroyed. Written acknowledgement of the boundary would be issued to residents, and any further harassment or false reporting would be addressed formally. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He stated terms like facts. The council took notes. They didn't argue. They didn't push back. They understood the shift in leverage. When the meeting ended, the ranch owner drove home through the familiar stretch of road, feeling neither victorious nor relieved. This wasn't about winning. It was about ending something that should never have started. But he also knew the woman wasn't finished. People who lost quietly didn't tend to start loudly, and she had started very loudly. That evening, a post appeared in the neighborhood group announcing that the trail project was under review, and that residents should refrain from approaching the ranch boundary. The language was carefully neutral. It didn't mention mistakes. It didn't assign responsibility. It simply redirected attention. Comments were limited. The woman didn't comment at all. Her silence was conspicuous. 2 days later, the final county survey report was published. It confirmed everything the preliminary notice had suggested, this time with formal authority. The boundary was closed. The record was complete. Any attempt to challenge it would require significant legal justification. And with that finality came the real consequence. The woman was no longer just an advocate who'd been wrong. She was a catalyst for potential liability, unauthorized actions, false reports, harassment allegations. The HOA board could distance itself, but the record would still show who pushed hardest and who ignored warnings. The ranch owner stood at his fence that night, watching the last light fade from the county markers. The land was quiet again, but this quiet felt earned. Somewhere in the neighborhood, the woman was likely recalculating, searching for a way to reframe the loss, but the story had shifted. The accuser was no longer pointing outward. The attention was turning inward, and once that happened, control was no longer hers to claim. Silence, for someone accustomed to control, was intolerable. The woman's absence from the neighborhood group didn't last long. When she returned, she did so with a new tone, one that tried to soften the sharp edges of defeat without admitting it existed. Her posts no longer spoke of access or authority. Instead, they leaned into victimhood, suggesting she had been misunderstood, misrepresented, and unfairly targeted for simply asking questions. The language shifted from certainty to sorrow, from leadership to lament. It was a calculated pivot, an attempt to rewrite the loss as sacrifice. She framed the county survey as an overreaction, implying that the process had escalated beyond what she'd intended. She spoke of stress, of pressure, of how hard it was to advocate for the community while being attacked. The omission was glaring. She never mentioned the false trespass calls. She never acknowledged the unauthorized markers or signage. She never explained the misaligned maps. Instead, she cast herself as someone who'd only wanted clarity and had been punished for persistence. The response was mixed, and that, more than outright criticism, unsettled her. Some residents offered sympathy. Others responded with careful neutrality. A few asked direct questions that went unanswered. The community had seen too much to return fully to the earlier narrative. Once doubt entered, it didn't leave quietly. The HOA board moved next. A formal notice went out announcing a review of internal procedures related to the trail proposal. It emphasized transparency and compliance, language that signaled concern without confession. It also quietly stripped the woman of any informal authority she'd been exercising. She was no longer listed as a point of contact. Her updates were replaced by board-approved summaries. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. She had gone from voice to variable. The ranch owner noticed the change in the physical world as well. One morning, he found the remaining HOA signs had been removed from the fence line. Not torn down or discarded in anger, but taken away cleanly, as if to erase their own existence. The ground where they'd stood was disturbed, but empty. It was the first tangible acknowledgement that the boundary was no longer up for debate. Still, the woman wasn't ready to let the story settle. She sought other angles, quieter ones. She contacted environmental groups, framing the creek as a shared ecological resource under threat. She hinted at runoff, wildlife corridors, and stewardship responsibilities. The implication was subtle but clear. If the boundary couldn't be challenged legally, it might be challenged morally. The ranch owner learned of this through a routine inquiry from a local conservation office, which he answered with documentation and transparency. The land had been managed responsibly for generations. The attempt fizzled under scrutiny. Frustration began to show through her careful messaging. Posts grew longer, more emotional. The balance between explanation and accusation blurred. She hinted at lawsuits without naming parties, at investigations without evidence. Each hint was designed to keep attention alive, to suggest that the story wasn't finished. But without substance, the hints fell flat. Behind closed doors, the HOA board took firmer steps. Minutes from a special session leaked quietly, noting concerns about reputational risk and legal exposure. The woman's actions were referenced indirectly, never by name, but the context was obvious. Recommendations were made to centralize communication and limit individual advocacy. Control was being reclaimed, not by her, but from her. The ranch owner remained largely invisible during this phase, and that invisibility became its own kind of presence. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't defending, he was simply continuing his routines, maintaining his land, documenting any anomalies. The lack of reaction denied the woman the confrontation she needed to sustain her narrative. Then came the letter she hadn't anticipated. It arrived not from the HOA, but from an attorney representing a neighboring landowner. The letter referenced the boundary dispute, the false claims, and the impact on adjacent properties. It requested clarification on whether the woman had acted independently or as an authorized HOA representative. The implications were significant. If she'd acted alone, she might bear personal responsibility. If she'd acted under HOA authority, the board might be exposed. Either way, the shield she'd relied on was cracking. Her response was delayed. Silence returned, this time heavier. Days passed without updates, without reframing. When she finally posted again, the tone was different, shorter, guarded. She announced she was stepping back from the issue to focus on personal matters. She thanked those who'd supported her. She didn't mention the ranch. The community moved on faster than she expected. New topics filled the feed. New complaints took center stage. The dispute, once all-consuming, became a cautionary memory. Some residents apologized privately to the ranch owner. Others avoided the subject altogether. One evening, as the sun set low and cast long shadows across the pasture, the ranch owner noticed a single car slow near the fence. It didn't stop. It didn't linger. It simply passed by, then disappeared down the road. He didn't know if it was hers. It didn't matter. The land was quiet, and this quiet felt different from before. It felt resolved. But resolution, he knew, didn't always mean closure. Some losses were carried, not conceded, and people who tried to rewrite defeat sometimes returned, not with authority, but with desperation. The story wasn't finished yet. It was simply waiting for its final reckoning. The reckoning didn't arrive with sirens or meetings or dramatic announcements. It arrived quietly, the way consequences usually do, slipping into place while everyone was busy pretending the problem had gone away. On the surface, the neighborhood had moved on. New complaints replaced old ones, the online group filled with discussions about noise, parking, and paint colors, and the ranch boundary faded from daily conversation. But beneath that surface, records were being reviewed, emails archived, and timelines reconstructed by people whose job it was to care about accuracy long after emotions burned out. The HOA board received its first formal notice from their insurer. It wasn't accusatory, but it was precise. It asked about potential exposure related to unauthorized actions taken during the proposed trail project. It referenced the county survey, the documented complaints, and the legal correspondence that had followed. Insurance companies didn't care about intentions or passion. They cared about risk, and risk in this case had a name, a paper trail, and a series of avoidable decisions. The board convened again, this time without public notice and without dramatic language. The mood was markedly different from the earlier emergency meeting. There were no printed maps on display, no bold claims about community rights. Instead, there were binders, legal summaries, and long pauses between questions. The woman's name came up repeatedly, not as an accuser, but as a factor. Emails she'd sent were read aloud. Instructions she'd given informally were scrutinized. The decision to place signs, to plant markers, to encourage documentation of the ranch owner's movements. All of it was examined not as advocacy, but as liability. The ranch owner learned none of this directly. He didn't need to. The effects reached him in subtler ways. One afternoon, he received a copy of a formal apology letter from the HOA, addressed broadly to affected parties. It acknowledged procedural errors, miscommunication, and overreach. It confirmed that the trail project had been permanently abandoned and that all records had been corrected to reflect the county's findings. The language was careful, lawyered, and impersonal, but it existed. And its existence mattered. A week later, the woman's name disappeared from the HOA committee listings. No announcement accompanied the change. She simply ceased to be referenced. Her social media activity dwindled. Her presence at community events faded. People didn't confront her. They didn't argue. They just stopped engaging. For someone who had thrived on attention and affirmation, the withdrawal was its own kind of judgment. The sheriff's department closed its internal review quietly. No charges were filed, but notes were added. Repeated unfounded complaints, misuse of reporting channels, escalation without cause. The ranch owner was informed that no further action was required on his part. The message, though understated, was clear. The record now reflected reality. One evening, as the ranch owner repaired a section of fence weathered by years rather than conflict, a county official stopped by unannounced. The visit wasn't investigative, it was administrative. The official thanked him for his cooperation during the verification process and informed him that the county had updated its development guidelines for adjacent properties, citing the dispute as an example of why clear boundary confirmation was required before project approval. The ranch owner nodded, understanding the significance. His patience had done more than protect his land. It had reshaped process. The woman attempted one final reframing, quietly, through a personal blog post that framed the entire ordeal as a lesson in standing up for community values. It was vague, defensive, and carefully worded to avoid specifics. It didn't gain traction. Without an audience willing to amplify it, the narrative collapsed under its own emptiness. Time continued to pass, and with it came a slow return to normalcy. The creek ran undisturbed, the pasture healed where footsteps had once pressed too deeply. The fence stood unchanged, not as a symbol of defiance, but as what it had always been, a line agreed upon long before entitlement tried to redraw it. The ranch owner understood now that the reckoning hadn't been about punishment. It had been about exposure. The woman hadn't been defeated by confrontation or argument. She'd been undone by documentation, process, and the refusal of reality to bend. As autumn approached and the land shifted colors, The ranch owner reflected on how close things had come to spiraling into something far uglier. All it had taken was one person convinced that persistence could replace permission. The system, imperfect as it was, had eventually corrected itself, but only because someone had stood still long enough for the truth to catch up. The story felt finished in the way storms feel finished, not erased but past. Yet the ranch owner knew there was one final chapter left, not of conflict, but of consequence. The kind that didn't announce itself, but lingered quietly in reputations, records, and the unspoken understanding that some lines, once crossed, could never be redrawn. After the reckoning faded from public view, what remained were the quieter consequences, the ones that didn't announce themselves, but settled into daily life like a weight that never quite lifted. The ranch owner noticed how the road felt emptier now, not because fewer cars passed, but because curiosity had been replaced by caution. People no longer slowed to stare at the fence or peer across the pasture. The boundary had become accepted, almost invisible again, and invisibility was its own kind of respect. For the first time in months, the land felt like it belonged only to itself, unburdened by the constant pressure of being questioned. In the neighborhood, the woman's absence created a vacuum that no one rushed to fill. Her name came up less and less, and when it did, it was often followed by an awkward pause. People didn't openly condemn her. They didn't need to. They remembered the stress, the police visits, the letters, the embarrassment of watching certainty collapse in real time. Memory, in small communities, was more durable than outrage. It didn't shout, it waited. The HOA continued functioning, but with a noticeable shift in tone. Announcements grew more careful. Proposals were layered with disclaimers and references to county approval. Committees were restructured. Decisions that once would have been rushed forward on confidence alone were now slowed by consultation and verification. The board had learned something it wouldn't say out loud. Unchecked enthusiasm could cost real money and real reputations. The woman's actions had become a silent case study, one no one wanted repeated. For the ranch owner, the aftermath came in moments of reflection rather than confrontation. He found himself thinking about how close the situation had come to turning permanent, how easily a lie repeated with enough conviction could have shifted reality if left unchallenged. He understood that many people in his position would have given in early, conceding a strip of land to avoid conflict, believing peace was worth more than principle. That was how boundaries disappeared, not all at once, but in pieces justified as compromises. One afternoon, while repairing a gate hinge that had nothing to do with the dispute, he realized how exhausting it had been to remain calm for so long, not because he'd been afraid, but because restraint required constant awareness. Every interaction had been weighed, every response measured. Now, with the pressure gone, the fatigue surfaced. He allowed himself a rare pause, sitting on the tailgate of his truck and looking out over the pasture, letting the land speak back in the only language it ever used: steadiness. The woman, meanwhile, faced a different kind of reckoning. Without the shield of authority or community backing, she encountered resistance in subtler ways. Emails went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations grew shorter. She wasn't ostracized